Totally. So I think first and foremost, I think AI is going to fundamentally revolutionize the way drugs are discovered, developed, and ultimately commercialized. I think if you look across the value chain, and one of the things I think I spent a lot of time thinking about is where does the biopharma industry disproportionately create value? And I think there are three core steps that are really fundamental to value creation. One is, do I pick the right therapeutic hypothesis? Right? So do I go after the right target with our drug? The second thing is, do I have the right molecule to prosecute that therapeutic hypothesis? And then the third, in my mind, is around how you effectively document that the right therapeutic is prosecuting that therapeutic hypothesis. So how do you generate data to support that underlying value proposition? Where we're spending a lot of time at Generate Biomedicines is actually on the middle term. So how do I come up with the optimal molecule to prosecute biology? This is largely based on the fact that what we're finding is by augmenting human intelligence with computational power, we're starting to understand the language of biology in really, really profound ways. The search space for proteins, if you think about the average protein being 200 amino acids long, and there are 20 natural selections at every point, you have 20 to the 200th power combinatorial possibilities in generating proteins. And while many would say, well, nature can, is the best arbiter and figures out the best answers, even with the most aggressive assumptions, nature has only sampled one drop of water in all the Earth's oceans of potential combinations of proteins. And we're using now artificial intelligence to survey that entire landscape. We've learned from every amino acid sequence across every species, 180 million amino acid sequences. We've learned from every protein structure that has been categorized by structural biologists, so about 200,000 high-quality, high-resolution structures. And now we're adding a functional component to that chart. And so we think, and what we're already starting to see is that we are coming up with just far superior answers and actually providing ourselves new tools to come up with therapeutics that can have a meaningful impact on disease. The first programs are now entering the clinic. But as we step back and then think about, how do you then, not only find the right targets, but also then document things? Inevitably, if you think about today's artisanal process of drug discovery, it's down to an individual genius or a team of geniuses that come up with a therapeutic hypothesis. They base their, understanding on the broader scientific literature, but also on, their own experimentation on those therapeutic hypotheses. Inevitably, artificial intelligence combining with that human ingenuity will come up with better answers. We're already seeing large language models that can digest the entirety of the internet. And while we have some brilliant scientists on this planet, the ability to digest the enormity of scientific literature from all of history is beyond any one individual's task. So we're going to come up with a better digestion of all of the scientific knowledge with the aid of these sort of large language models. And I think that's going to set off a revolution in our understanding of the underlying therapeutic targets that we're going to go after, understanding different biological pathways in very complex disease sets. So you can think about, over the last 2 decades, we've become better at understanding, the molecular basis for cancer. We still have a long way to go. Survival rates are still, for many types of cancer in the 20-25% range. So there's 75% of patients that don't have adequate cures. Our better understanding of these disease pathways and then combining that with better tools is going to help us create huge, huge value. And then if we go to the documentation or kind of the clinical development side of things, I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of identifying the right patients for the right treatment at the right time. And technology is going to help us do that. When you're a cancer patient and you're newly diagnosed, the first thing many do is go on the internet and search what their doctor just told them. That patient now becomes identifiable. If we can speed up the time for patient recruitment, and actually study closeout, there's huge value to society in getting these treatments to patients faster. These are all things that technology will help us enable. And so I think, whether it's in the target identification, whether it's in the molecular definition, whether it's in the documentation associated with clinical development, AI and ML is going to help revolutionize each of those pieces. The last thing I'd say, and one of the things that we're spending a lot of time with these large language model tools right now on, is actually regulatory submissions and clinical protocols.
Yep.
Large language models are exceptional at creating a starting point. Now, it can't be unsupervised. They actually do act as a co-pilot, but it gives you the 80% rough draft almost immediately. That's a huge productivity gain. And I think, for our industry, one of the things that I've obsessed about over the last 20 years is there are two fundamental challenges. One is research productivity has been going down for decades in a row. The second of which, and I think somewhat interrelated, but somewhat independent, is that pricing practices have been abhorrent, and patients that need medicines haven't been able to access them. What AI offers the prospect of is changing the productivity equation for research. And when you change the productivity equation, you have the opportunity now to rethink business models to ensure more patients get the therapies that they need. And that's what's so exciting about this kind of intersection of technology and biology right now.
That is great, Mike. Just so exciting. And you actually went to where I was going to go later on with one of my questions, because just this explosion of productivity is going to make the math not work on the economic side, right?
Exactly.
But let's get there in a minute. Before we go to the risks and what would have to happen on the regulatory and reimbursement side, maybe if you could illustrate what you've just described in such a nice way, but illustrate it with a specific example or two of perhaps a candidate drug being selected and how you used AI to both do the identification and then get it through validation and to a point where you think it'll have a higher likelihood of success.
Yeah, so a great example is, the way we traditionally find antibody therapies is we immunize a human, a mouse, or a llama. We cull through plasma, we see what sticks to a target, and then we try and modify. The problem is, in many respects, then, we are reliant upon the immune system for the answers that we ultimately prosecute. One of the things that, we see in biology is the immune system oftentimes focuses in on certain regions of certain targets, and you find other regions of those targets that are more seen as immune cryptic. You may not generate antibodies to a domain because it houses essential machinery for biology. One of the cases that we looked at was post the emergence of Omicron with SARS-CoV-2. What we found was that the receptor binding domain of the spike protein was mutating rapidly, way faster than we had previously thought. Those mutations undermined every antibody therapy that had been developed. They lost potency, and ultimately they had to be withdrawn from the emergency use authorization because they were no longer effective. We asked ourselves, could we use our technology specifically to target a domain that the immune system does not generate antibodies to? And if we could target that domain, could we find a protein that was potent and broadly neutralizing against all variants of concern? This just simply couldn't have been done using traditional approaches. And what we found was that we could target the base of the stem of the spike protein, an area called the stem helix peptide, that houses the fusion machinery for viruses. The reason our body doesn't create potent neutralizing antibodies to that domain is because if you interrupt the fusion machinery, it undermines the viability of the virus. And so, we basically have now come up with an antibody that binds to this domain. It neutralizes not only all pre-existing variants, but neutralizes all SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-1, MERS variants. And even in escape studies, we see that, it holds up against the future threats. And so it's these sort of leaps that these technologies offer the prospect. It's giving us tools that were previously not in our arsenal. And by finding these new tools, one of the things that excites me the most is oftentimes we think about risk and reward as kind of this linear trade-off. The more risk you take, the higher the reward. Whenever you find technologies that provide new tools to prosecute biology, all of a sudden you break the risk-reward continuum because you provide tools that may allow you to go after biologically validated pathways that have never had the means of actually addressing them. And so for us, these are the types of things that really excite us. And the benefit of these sort of tools ultimately will be, we cure disease, we save lives, and we create a lot of value for society.
So I love the fact that you talked about breaking the risk-reward trade-off. Uh, some would say we're introducing a new set of risks with AI. Would love to hear your thoughts about what those are and how you're dealing with them.
Well, we spend a lot of time on this side of things. It's interesting. One of the features that has probably gained a ton of notoriety with these large language models has been the hallucinations.
Yeah.
And we actually view hallucinations in biology as a feature, not a bug. And I'll explain why. For us, biology and the inherent complexity of it is far too complex today, and the data is far too sparse to be able to solve from a purely computational standpoint. We have to experimentally validate every suggestion that comes out of our model. And in doing so, you can actually retrain the model based on not only the successes, but also the failures that accrue. We learn as much from the hallucinations because essentially what you're doing now is you're starting to program biology. If I can connect, what does this amino acid sequence represent in terms of structure and function? And then based on the actual experimentation and measurement of both the biophysical properties, the functional properties, I can see which codes basically are giving me activity, and I can learn from that. I can now start to actually contemplate moving the drug discovery process from this artisanal trial and error based approach to a programming or engineerable endeavor. And while we're really early in that journey, I'm not here to say that biology will be solved over the next 5 years by any means. But if I step back and think about like the majesty of biology, right now we probably understand 5-10% of biology, despite it staring at our face for all of our existence. Over the course of the next decade, is it unrealistic to think that we may understand 10, 20, 30% of biology? That would be transformative in terms of the tools we have at our disposal. And so I think some of these risks, the key here is not to believe you can solve everything computationally. There are some things you can solve computationally, but experimentation is going to be really, really critical. Generating substantive data sets is really important. One of the challenges with biology is the inherent variability of measurement and the lack of precision of measurement. One of the things we've learned with all of the AI tools is data quality and data quantity are really, really important to train models. And we need to do that well. Now, if you take this to the extreme, and one of the things that we recently published in Nature a few weeks ago was a new generative model called Chroma that basically expands the protein universe. In the 4 billion years the planet has been around, nature has come up with about 20,000 unique concepts for proteins. And proteins are the machines of biology. They drive probably about 95% of biology. What we've been able to distill down is what does it mathematically mean to be a protein based on our studying of the space. Amazingly, what we're seeing now is that these new mathematically correct proteins are expressing at an astonishing rate, somewhere between 10 and 50% expression. So if I were to suggest 10 sequences, We're getting somewhere between 1 and 5 new proteins that nature's never discovered. Those are going to create tools. Some of those proteins will be future drivers of biology. Some will be toxins.
That's right.
How we think about these sort of things, how we think about which pieces of biology we push on is going to be really, really important. But like any great technology, it can be used for good or it can be used for bad. I think the benefits here far outweigh the risks, but we need to be thoughtful in its development.
Yeah, so agree with you 100%. But I guess that's the question, right? How do we manage these risks? Because everyone is not approaching it with the same sense as you are.
Yeah, I think actually, in many ways, the place to think more carefully about is ultimately synthesis. So if you think about, current state of biotech, we actually classify working on certain viruses, and you actually have to have legal clearance to work on certain types of technologies. There's, the BSL system with different levels of rating.
Right,
You
but
can
now
do
you
this.
could work on it in silico and not have to comply with those. So would you need new regulations, new ethical
There's no doubt
frameworks?
you're going to need new regulations. I think you're going to need regulations at synthesis, right? Because just creating something computationally doesn't harm humanity. Actually, building it into the physical substrate does introduce a risk to humanity. And I think, but those tools, just to be candid, exist today.
Right.
We can manipulate biology. You see, the rumor mill loves talking about how different viruses could be manipulated to be more immunogenic using either traditional error-prone PCR or computational techniques. Obviously, the tools now are becoming more profound, but we have to lean on kind of, both existing and new ways of surveillance in order to make sure that these tools are used for good rather than bad.
Yeah, so I think we get that.
Yeah,
But for the industry to gain and retain public trust, surely you need more than that, because that level of understanding may or may not exist. And as you said, the rumor mills will take off. There'll
yeah.
all kinds of disinformation. And so I'm really curious, as you think of this vision of being a computationally native company that's um, developing drugs in this way. And when you say things like new proteins that nature has not developed, it raises fears. I've talked about it in
Totally.
my idea of the spooky mountain. These are exactly the kinds of things that create fear. So how do you, as a company, as an industry, think about uh, going beyond, frankly, the science and thinking about how you can fit in a responsible way in society that needs to trust the industry?
Yeah. Well, so we spend a lot of time in Washington educating policymakers, educating lawmakers. One of the things that I worry about are the unintended consequences of regulating AI from a technology perspective and how that could actually slow down scientific progress in a meaningful way. Now, I agree with you that we have to be very, very thoughtful about the unintended consequences
Mhm.
in a scientific domain, but they are very different than the copyright infringement concerns that
Yeah.
many have raised in Washington. For us, we believe in a few things, right? One, we believe in transparency. We published our core model so that the scientific community could actually evaluate it, right?
Is it open
That's
source?
Oh, it is.
Okay.
We provide licenses to academia in particular. Um, it was published in Nature 2 weeks ago. The code is available for download. And so, we want people to actually understand both the thinking behind our computational approach, but also the safeguards, importantly,
Yeah.
that we've put in to, in some ways, protect against some of the considerations that I think that you're noting. At the same time, I think there are very tangible ways that we can work with lawmakers to appropriately regulate those few spots. Because I only think there are a couple of things that are really concerning. I mentioned earlier, creating a new toxin. The reality is we already have toxins that are pure, that are more than sufficient to create as much harm in the world as possible. What you really worry about is self-replicating viruses.
Yeah.
And how do you actually be very specific about where there are reasons for concern? How can we potentially regulate those spaces and put the right controls from both a societal perspective, but also from a legislative perspective, without undermining the broader effort? Because I think, on balance, the number of opportunities for good here far outweighs the concerns.
Absolutely. Satish, you have a final question?
Yeah, so Mike, that was very illustrative of the beneficial hallucination, so to say, and the downstream risks and how you manage those. So if I had one last question, what's your long-term vision for the role of AI in biotech, biopharma, and how do you see its evolution over the next few years or over the decade?
Yeah, I mean, our long-term vision is that biology will ultimately be instantly programmable. So we can come up with the optimal medicine for every patient's unique condition. Now, we are a long way from that. I'm talking like the 100-year vision, right? What we're starting to see, though, is this migration from trial and error to programmability. And that's what's so exciting. Biology is the planet's first information technology.
Yeah.
And we've never really viewed it as such because the complexity of biology has escaped human imagination for all this time. Over the past, century, we've seen massive improvements in, based on our understanding of physics, based on our understanding of chemical systems. The reality is, I think the next century will be biology century. And it's going to be through augmented intelligence. So humans plus computational power that will ultimately help us understand the mathematical underpinnings of biology in a way that allows us to increasingly change the probabilities of success and program biology to improve human health.
Fantastic. That's really well put, Mike. That was great.
Well, it's an exciting time. I mean, I've never, you just go over the arc of history, right? This is one of the things that super excites me. Whenever complex fields become engineerable, industrial revolutions occur.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we watched it in semiconductors. We watched it with, when Bernoulli's principle distilled the principles of flight,
Yeah.
Ohm's law, right? These things, we've never gotten to the mathematics of biology.
Yeah, yeah. You know what it reminds me of? It makes me think of, if you think of the arc of medicine, and you're quite right. Originally, it is software in some senses with ATCG instead of zeros and ones. But um, uh, we were in an age of empiricism in medicine for thousands of years. We try
Yeah,
stuff, and if bark from a tree worked, we used it, and we tried
exactly.
like trephination or bloodletting and all of that. And then we moved to a sort of reductionist approach where we try to understand scientifically what happened, and it failed because we
Yeah.
didn't have the tools. And so we moved to empiricism and RCTs and all of that. And to me, it feels almost like this is giving us the opportunity to go back to that reductionist view of medicine, where maybe we can actually understand what's happening underneath as an information problem, and then try to fix it by software.
I think that's right. And I think if you look at the arc of change, this is, if I joined Generate 3 years ago. If I were to have projected where we would be in 3 years from starting, I would have grossly underestimated the rate of change.
Yeah.
And I think, everyone that is in this AI space is seeing these exponential gains. And I personally believe, the debate we have now is not, will this fundamentally change the way every drug is discovered? The answer is that will definitely happen. The question is, how fast will that happen?
Right, right. That's great. So, looking forward to putting these views out to the world. And
They're strong. They're strongly
oh,
held, but
they're very
certainly
well
things have
stated as well.
changed.
I'm going to stop the recording. I wish that.
Sounds great. And do you need me to do anything special in terms of where how I'm sitting or anything like that?
No,
Nothing at
no,
all.
that's
We're interested in what's in here. So
Sounds good.
So Anna Marie, so I sent you a few questions, and I wanted to just get your perspectives on that, and feel free to use examples from your own organization, as I know at Ginkgo Bioworks. So, I think the broad question I wanted to ask is, from your perspective, what do you see as the main opportunities of to use AI in biotech, pharma, and the supporting ecosystem across the value chain, right? And looking all the way from discovery through commercialization and supporting functions, and what's like really table stakes, and what are differentiating from your perspective. We'd love to hear your perspectives on that, and we'll dive deeper into some of those based on our conversation.
Sure. So one of the ways that I like to think about the impact of AI is that there are a couple different vectors that I'm seeing it impact. So one is just efficiency, right? Things that humans can do, but AI can help humans do it better, faster, cheaper. And I think that's relevant for a lot of today's applications of AI. So certainly the type of work around human language and the generative AI models that we've sort of seen sweep the industry over the last year. What I'm really excited about, particularly in the healthcare field, is the ability for AI to become superhuman, to do things that humans cannot do, right? So I cannot look, and our best scientists at Ginkgo cannot look at a random piece of DNA and tell you what it does. But AI has the ability to do that when trained with enough data. Now, we still have a lot of work to do to actually build robust models that are kind of as intuitive and insightful as some of the large language models for biology. But what's really neat is that, humans didn't invent the language of biology, right? Like biology invented us. And so there's this really incredible opportunity for these AI tools, when trained with enough data and given enough compute, to do things that humans simply cannot do with the tools that are available to us today. And so particularly in the area of discovery, I'm really excited about what AI is going to open up. Now, I think that then opens up a whole slew of questions around how the rest of the ecosystem needs to evolve in order to deal with what I expect to be a real influx of innovation in the industry. But I'm really excited about the opportunities there on the discovery front.
and what about further down the chain that Satish outlined?
Yeah. So Ginkgo operates very squarely on the discovery side. Our customers obviously then are taking those therapeutics, for example, and running them through clinical trials and distributing to customers and tracking patients, obviously, thereafter. We're seeing a lot of investment being made, obviously, on clinical trial design, picking the right cohorts, identifying the right patient populations. That is, I think, already quite advanced in this space. One of the conversations we've been having that I think is particularly interesting is, how do you manage clinical trials? Like, even if you design them perfectly and that's all great, like how does the FDA scale to handle a 10xing of the number of new molecules that could be hitting clinic that meet preclinical toxicity studies or efficacy studies. And right now, I think, especially as we start talking about kind of responsible AI, there's a lot of reliance on these types of systems to continue to be a kind of checkpoint and safety gate in the adoption of AI across the industry. But I think that safety gate is going to start feeling a lot like a bottleneck in the next couple of years that we'll need to deal with.
That is really interesting, because in our conversation so far, what we've been hearing about responsible AI and so on has been focused on the AI itself. And you're pointing out a risk that, frankly, has not come up in our conversations before, which is that it's actually the traditional system that's at risk because of the pace of innovation that it's going to face. How do you think we, as a society, as regulators, and so on, should deal with a risk like that?
Ooh, look, I think when we talk about responsible AI, we need to talk about the broader ecosystem always. Like it's not just the AI tools, and it's not just the environment in which it exists. It is both. I am definitely not an expert on the FDA and regulation around drug approval, so I'll probably stay away from that debate. But where we tend to see the conversation more is around the tool itself, and how do you ensure that these tools are not used for for malintent. And what I might add to that conversation is that while I think it's really important to do everything we can to build safety and alignment into these tools, it's not enough. The cat is out of the bag. AI is getting easier to work with, compute is getting cheaper, biology is getting easier to engineer. This stuff is all becoming much, much more accessible to a much wider group of people. And on the one hand, that's really exciting, because I think we will see incredible innovation, life-saving medicines, climate solutions come out of this technology. On the other hand, it's terrifying because it absolutely can be misused. And no amount of, red teaming these models is going to really keep that in check. And so what we need to do is we need to build an ecosystem around these tools that help us mitigate the threats that are inherent in the advancement of these technologies. We did that for computing, right? As computing grew and became more prevalent and we all became interconnected, threats emerged from that, right? Viruses on your computer, malware, information theft, or identity theft, et cetera. And we built up a robust cybersecurity infrastructure to try to protect that, realizing that this great technology opened up new doors, new avenues for risk. The same thing is true in the biological realm with AI. This will open up new opportunities and huge new risks. And we can't just close the door on the risk. It's out there. We need to build cybersecurity, but for biology, we need to build biosecurity. That's one piece of the puzzle, but I do think it's important to think about the ecosystem, whether you're looking at, just how do we get drugs to market, but also how do you protect the underlying technology?
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit, because, you could argue that we failed as a society when it came to safeguards around data privacy, for instance, when you're talking about computing, or you talk about some of the harms of social networks and so on. And, technology is moving faster than society and regulators can handle. So I'd love for you to delve precisely into that point you just made, which is, given that we actually don't have a great record, we tend to try to catch up once the technology is out of the bag. What should we be doing responsibly right now to manage how AI is being used in biology, from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. We talk about this a lot in many ways. I think that the concept of like a platform business model really emerged or took root with many of the tech platforms that we now know. And I think there was a mentality in the early days of that industry forming that as a platform, you're not responsible for how people use your platform or your tool. You're just responsible for keeping it running and keeping uptime, right? So you're just the pipes. You're not responsible for what goes through the pipes. Ginkgo is a platform, but as I say, we always took the view that biology is a very different substrate from information, right? And you cannot afford to abdicate responsibility for what is done with your platform when your platform is fundamentally allowing for the engineering of biology. And so culturally, we always took a very different tact on that, which involved building in platform security, building broader biosecurity infrastructure. But I do think it is it's a cultural change that I think is happening, to be fair, even across the tech industry, maybe begrudgingly enforced with regulation. But I think there has been a recognition. But I think you're absolutely right. This technology is moving faster than regulation, certainly. And probably more dangerously, it's moving faster than practitioners, I think, even can foresee the potential side effects, I guess, if you will. And so I honestly, I don't know that the cultural change is enough. I think there are a lot of people who are aware of this, but there's also a fear that if you don't adopt quickly, you're going to fall behind. And so these competing pressures are very real, and I don't know that we have a good solution for them. A lot of folks are working on responsible AI and AI governance across the world. World Economic Forum has a summit on this. Obviously the U.S. government is pulling together experts. There was the AI Safety Summit a few weeks ago in Bletchley. A lot of folks are working on it, but I haven't heard great solutions come out of that yet.
So one of the leaders behind this series is the Responsible AI Institute. And obviously they're thought leaders and execution leaders on this in this field. What would you like them to be thinking about when it comes to responsible AI as it applies to biotech or biology? Because clearly there are all kinds of general principles that you can apply across many industries to do with how you deal with privacy and safety and reliability and alignment and all those things. How do those apply in a special way to biology?
I think it starts with conversations, and I think those are to some degree happening. But what I'm most afraid of is when I see these conversations, they tend to be quite polarizing or polarized. And so what I tend to see are people who either only have the appetite to talk about the opportunities presented or think AI is going to kill us all and we need to stop. And I think particularly when you're looking at the interface of AI and biology, very few people are an expert in both of those subjects. And so biology feels like a really scary end of the world type of an application and topic for AI experts who understand the power of AI, but feel like they don't understand enough about biology. When you talk to the biology experts, you'll generally hear, man, biology is really hard. AI is not going to suddenly make this trivial tomorrow, right? It is a tool. It's going to create some more incremental progress. We are really excited about it, but it's still actually really hard to make an effective bioweapon, for example. And so I think there is a joint education process that can happen here where, candidly, I think biologists have been too dismissive of AI and need to understand a little bit more how AI is going to disrupt their field. But on the other hand, I think the AI community, and particularly the more fearful side of that community, needs to more deeply understand how biology works and what it would take to really create something dangerous with biology. And the truth is, thankfully, it's still pretty hard. And so we do have some time, I think, to come together and start really understanding where these threats are going to emerge earliest and try to start building some infrastructure and safeguards around that.
So let's talk about this for a moment, about the threat of a bioweapon. But I don't think the bar for responsible AI needs to be that low, that all we're doing is preventing a bioweapon. There are other issues like privacy and bias and all of that. So we'll get to that in a moment. But just stay with me on bioweapons for a second. Our regulatory framework is focused on what happens once you synthesize something or start synthesizing something, right? There's safety around lab security and what you can do and so on. Is it true that, or is it a fair concern that using AI in this way enables you to get much further down the path before you hit that level of scrutiny?
I think the hope for AI in biology is that you can reduce the amount of experimentation that is needed to get to a successful result. And so in that way, you could argue that AI allows you to get further before you start synthesizing, but our experience is that you still get a lot more value out of that recursive loop with laboratory work. than you do with just working on iterative loops with an AI model. The laboratory element is still quite important in what we've seen, and particularly if you're trying to design a more complex system. I think someone would be very, very hard pressed to do that in a zero-shot manner today.
Fair enough. But let's focus on the more day-to-day set of threats, the more insidious ones.
Yeah.
Using AI to produce chemicals that can affect people in certain ways, or where the underlying goals are biased in some way because of the data, because of the goals of the entity, and so on. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you think are those somewhat insidious risks that you may not see on the surface, but we as responsible AI practitioners or advocates need to be concerned about.
Yeah, I would just say AI exacerbates existing bias in the system, right? Like AI is only going to be as good as the data that is fed into it. I think, again, it has the opportunity, I think, to allow us to be much more inclusive, but it does rely on the human who is training it, or the human who did the work that the AI is being trained on, right? So, there's some kind of, you could call them cute or depressing, I'm not sure, examples of AI, as applied to the healthcare field. On the one hand, you hear doctors saying that they have zero tolerance for error, right? In AI, it's a life and death situation. If that AI model provides the wrong piece of advice, patient will die. So there's no tolerance for error. Well, that AI was also trained on a lot of doctors who make errors all the darn time, and so do you really want an AI that is only as good as the average doctor? No, I want an AI that's much better than the average doctor. And so figuring out how to, there is a lot, and we see this in the biological space as well. Like there is a lot of value that is still generated in these models based on how you curate the data that goes into them. And I think we have the opportunity to be much more thoughtful around the way that we're curating AI models today. But we will only be as good or as bad as our existing systems today. And so obviously in the healthcare field, there's a long history of white men being overrepresented in clinical trials and drugs therefore failing for women or other groups. And so we face the same risks here, and AI has the ability to amplify that if we don't address it, but we needed to address that anyway. I think it's just an amplification of existing risk.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask one question and then hand it off to Satish to ask whatever's on his plate, because I've been dominating the conversation. But I'm curious if you can share with us, and I think it'd be really helpful for folks listening to the webinar to think about a real example, and it could be a composite or whatever you're comfortable sharing, of how you've thought about responsible AI for a project from start to finish.
Yeah, so we've built what I would describe more as biosecurity tools, but it looks like an earlier version of responsible AI into our platform. So for example, any piece of DNA that we ever synthesize gets run against any known pathogen. We have done programs for IARPA, which is the CIA's innovation fund, around detection of or identification of whether or not a particular element of DNA was engineered or not, so that you can start understanding whether a particular threat was man-made or nature evolved. So we've certainly invested in those types of biosecurity tools that I think are going to be part of a responsible AI infrastructure. The projects we do for customers tend to be a little bit more removed from that. Certainly every project that we take on goes through what we call our caring framework, and we have a team that reviews all those projects to ensure that it meets certain standards, certainly ethical standards, but beyond that, to ensure that across a diverse cross section of our employee base and other advisors. We believe that this is a project that is worth doing, but we do tend to be a step removed simply because we're not dealing as much with human cells, human patients, et cetera. We're typically engineering, at the protein level or at a therapeutic level, and so don't face quite as many day-to-day questions.
No, fair enough. I'm just curious, the governance of this caring committee of, if I got that right, is it all internal? Do you have external experts on it who can, raise their hands when they see something that's not quite right?
Yeah, it is primarily an internal body, but also with some external support and consultation.
Okay, Satish, thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Anne-Marie. That was fascinating. And one question I want to ask you is, how are you dealing with hallucinations, right? As you get very specific. You sit on a tremendous amount of data. You spoke about curating language models. How are you fencing around those? Curious to hear.
Yeah, I think hallucinations are a feature, not a bug, candidly, in biology, right? Like we want the model to create something, and we want the model to make things up, because sometimes those made up things actually make more sense than anything the model has seen before, anything that we can design. It is why in biology, the lab and the loop is still so important, right? So like we are going to test all of those ideas that the AI comes up with, and we're going to see which of those make any sense. That is fundamentally like alignment built into the process with which we use AI. But we see a lot of value from the AI making things up in the field of biology.
Great. So a couple of follow-up questions on that before we, I want to ask where your roadmap is leading to. Could you give us some specific examples of how you're using AI? I know you touched upon a couple of things, real life examples of what you're doing internally or for customers, given the amount of data you're generating. I'm curious to see some examples of how you're using this. And then as a follow-up to that, where do you see that roadmap, in terms of your longer term vision for the role of AI, over the next few years and or the next decade, perhaps specifically in your company as well as in the broader industry? So I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, so Ginkgo has been using AI ML tools for a long time, simply by nature of the amount of data that we're generating in the labs. The two main groups within Ginkgo that are, I'd say, heavier users of the technology, one is our protein engineering group. So that group will take a particular protein and say, and the customer or the project might demand that we change certain features about it. So it needs to be more thermostable. It needs to bind to its target better. It needs to better catalyze a certain reaction, you name it, any number of functions. And that team uses an ensemble of different AI tools to design mutations to those proteins. And quite often what we'll find, to your question about hallucination earlier, very often the winning design, the best performing protein as measured in a lab, looks almost nothing like what the best scientists designed as a starting point. Might have 20% similarity or something to that original protein. And so it really is when you can use AI to search a much, much broader field that you often find the best performance. So that's one area. The other area is DNA design. So similarly, like DNA is a language, right? ACTTTGGG, it's letters and they're assembled to have meaning. And so that group is designing DNA for function. So you might want a piece of DNA that helps a protein be expressed in a particular environment, or helps a protein be expressed in a particular tissue of the body, so that it's only delivering a therapeutic protein or cure in a particular area. So those today are the two heaviest users of AI tools. Where we're going with that, again, today we've basically been using off-the-shelf tools and bringing our data and data generation capabilities into those tools. Where we're going is sort of a hypothesis that if you think about the landscape of AI models, you have these foundation models, right? So GPT-4 is a language model, a large language model that is the foundation for a task-specific model in ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is a really good chat bot, and it has been fine-tuned to do that task well in a process called reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? So the foundation model enables this application to do a very particular task when trained with humans giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that task for a while. In biology, you can think about it similarly. So there are foundation models like ESM, for example. It's a protein foundation model. It understands the language of proteins. But what ends up being most useful for a customer is the task-specific model, right? I now want a protein to bind better. That's not something that's necessarily intrinsic in the foundation model. The foundation model understands proteinness. It doesn't necessarily understand, well, this protein will catalyze that reaction. That requires you to bring in many different types of data. And Ginkgo has been most focused on that second piece of it historically, right? How do we answer the specific task at hand, leveraging lots of different tools. We also, though, think that we have the opportunity, given the amount of data that we've collected, to innovate at the foundation layer as well. And so I think you'll see us continue to push at both of those levels where the understanding of proteinness improves when you are able to add more data into that foundation layer. And we can take all of that experimental data and train many task-specific models to answer the types of questions that are relevant for customer programs.
Well, that's inspiring. I think our webinar audience is going to love listening to some of that. That's a great vision, and really enjoyed our chat. I hope it's okay if we have some follow-on. We can come back to you just to round things out when we start putting this together.
Yeah, no problem.
And Anna Marie, I also separately emailed you. I think Nicola, you was stopping the recording, and then
yeah.
And thank you for the email. I got a good sense for where you want to go, so thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. So Staphane, feel free to intersperse with specific examples of how you are doing things within Moderna. But I just wanted to start off at a very broad level, right? Like where you look at the main opportunities you see to use AI in biotech pharma across the value chain, right? Continuum all the way from discovery through commercialization, and also the supporting functions around GA and HR and other things that you're doing. And what do you feel are the basic table stakes, or versus what is differentiating from your perspective? And Moderna has been excellent in using at least thinking of AI across the continuum. So we'd love to hear from you where you see specifically for you and broader for the industry.
Sure. So thank you again for having me. So let me start by framing how important I think AI is for the world and the business world. I believe it's as big a disruption as the desktop computer was when it came into work. And so I think it's going to impact every job. I think it's going to impact every business process. And so we've had actually quite a heavy experience of machine learning pre-ChatGPT. ChatGPT, of course, was an accelerator, but we've done machine learning since 2016 as a company in science, in R&D, to be able to get insight through very large data sets that it was impossible for human brain to get all those pieces together to figure out a new hypothesis generation in the labs. And we got a couple examples that were so stunning in terms of the insight, which actually nobody believed initially, but then we run the experiment, and what was predicted by our machine learning system actually worked in animals. That really was a big wake-up moment for all of the leadership team at Moderna. And so, of course, large language model like ChatGPT was a big acceleration. Very quickly, we developed MChat, which is a license from OpenAI, but without the data going back to them for being able to keep everything, inside the company. And so as we launch MChat, it's being used across the entire value chain. So you have scientists using it to invent new lipid system where literally the system spits chemical structure that the team then goes and make physically to test in animal. It's being used in clinical development. And I believe the impact to the business and to patients will be very profound, because if you think about it, from the time you said, I'm going to take this drug to the clinic, to the time the same drug, if it works, is approved, you have literally hundreds of business processes through clinical studies, through manufacturing, and each of those can be transformed incredibly. Just an example, we have put in place recently is the dose finding. We have to pick a dose selection to get into a phase 3. That process used to take around 60 days in a paper computer world with humans. But we basically build a bot that for the last 2 products has been telling us the dose that then people still check by hand. They're a bit scared about it. But that is done in literally 2 minutes. So you go 60 days to 2 minutes. And think about the hundreds of processes that have to happen through that big process of going to the clinic to getting a drug approved. Another one that is quite interesting to show you how game-changing it is interaction with regulators. When we file to the regulators for approval, like we did recently last summer for RSV, another respiratory virus, the regulators from around the world send us email with questions. So we develop a bot that scans the inbox of all the regulatory team all the time, even when they're sleeping. And it basically reads the email, either questions directly in the body of the email or document attached, and then draft using MChat, draft a reply to the regulator. It's done in a minute or 2. That reply is then sent automatically to that employee and his or her boss, and then they just have to read it, and then they send it to the regulator. That process usually will take days, because when you have 20, 50, 100 questions from Switzerland, and they are clinical study and they're manufacturing, and then you have the same thing coming from Singapore, and you keep going through around the world, it's a lot of work, because the questions are slightly different, but you need to go pick the data that you need to basically write and frame an answer. So that's another example of a time saved. The quality of our responses is just incredible. It's happening in manufacturing. It's happening in legal, where right now all of our contracts are drafted by MChat. The legal team just input in a very big prompt all the new features of a contract, but it uses all our past contract that we've uploaded to basically do the first draft. Same thing with patents. All the patents we're filing now are first drafted by MChat from the scientist, not even the lawyer. So the scientist basically input the new invention into the system that we developed that bot. The system then sent to the lawyer and to the scientist the written patent draft to be reviewed and approved and then sent to the US Patent Office. So I can just go on and on and on. It's like, we really believe that there's not one business process, there's not one employee, including your servitor, whose job isn't going to be reinvented because of the availability of large language model.
It makes me think, Staphane, it's just so exciting the way you're describing this. That I forget who said it, but the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And it feels like Moderna is living in that future that we're all going to see. So much as it's so exciting, there are concerns out there, and some of them well-founded, some of them are just what I call the spooky mountain, just unfounded fears around the adoption of this technology. So how are you thinking about risks, whether real or perceived? I know you've got the academy and so on, but just talk to us a little bit about how you are addressing those.
Yes. So our team is very concerned about the downside. And so in all the example I took to you so far, there's always at this stage, I don't know about the future, because we're all inventing it every day, but there's always at this stage still human intervention to make the final decision. So what the large language model are doing for us at Moderna today is to draft documents, to make recommendation, but it's always a human deciding what we do, or a team deciding what we do. What we're trying to define is a set of rules that we're basically embedding in a system to put kind of boundaries. And as we like to tell teams, you know, what we've used in the large language model as our boundaries is really, you know, of course, the law and of course, ethics. You know, it has to be ethical and legal to be something that we want to contemplate. And so I think at this stage, we still have a lot of human intervention. What the system is providing to us is the aggregation of data, the speed to do that aggregation of data. So it's a big enabler. The piece we're wrestling with as a team is what other things are on the corner where we could potentially go without humans. Just think about the example with a response to regulators. You could decide to have just, when the response is drafted, it could go without human intervention to the regulator automatically. And so we are thinking about things like that because it will have a lot of implication on the company's brand, on if we decide some things like the dose selection on humans in terms of safety. And so we're trying to think about the risk and try to always start by those things that have big upside, but very manageable risk, and staying clear of the things that we think have a lot of downside, and using internal experts and external experts to help us think through those things, because we believe the day is going to happen and depend who is going to do it first, and then it's going to become a competitive disadvantage if you don't do it. So we have to be very thoughtful and careful. So we're trying to be ahead of it, so we have time to think about it.
Yeah, fair enough. And you know what we've seen is that a lot of people are thinking about a whole bunch of risks around privacy and hallucinations and so on. I think of them as first order risks, but there's a whole level of second and third order risks that I don't know if we as companies, as society, are thinking of enough. I mean, I'll be clear. I, as a strategy consultant, am really excited for the day when I'm not needed anymore. And already, you know, I use ChatGPT all the time. I'd be very happy when it replaces me. But we are seeing indications, for example, it's almost like the default option. People tend to default to the default option. And my hospital clients are using things like observing how long a screen is viewed for to make sure the provider is actually not just checking off what the AI is suggesting when they're synthesizing medical notes, for example.
Yeah.
And so when you scale this, I'm curious, what are those sorts of checks and balances that you need to put in beyond just saying, oh, there's a human in the loop, because humans are fallible and humans put under time pressure, and everyone may not be approaching it as ethically as you are.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think there's what can you do with one human versus what can you do with a team.
Yes.
But I think when you have more than one person, you have more check and balance just in terms of how people are responsible to each other and challenge each other. I think we're fortunate at Moderna that we set up a culture since day one of very open challenge, because we want the best decision serving patients. And we don't believe that the best decision always come from the more senior person. And so I think the role of teams, like in the decision-making process on the dose selection that we spoke about, is a team of doctors. Again, going back to what are the right professionals, also because of their training, have a higher sense of purpose and responsibility than you might have other human beings do. So that's another piece that I'm thinking a lot about, is what type of background, experience, even training, you know, do we have enough ethicists in the company? You know, as a company evolves, do I need less scientists? But do I need more ethicists or people thinking about this type of issues? Because as you remove some of the work is going to shift. Like we saw, which is why I like the analogy with a desktop computer, how it changed the world. It might be different with AI, you know, 10 years, 20 years from now. But they still have a lot of work after the desktop was put in place. It's just different work.
Yeah.
So my head of legal, my head of HR, and I are spending time thinking about exactly that, which is, are there new skills that we never really needed in the company before at scale that we're going to need now? Like, you know, Nobody had big IT teams before you had desktop and software in the enterprise.
Yeah.
Except if you're a big bank or whatever with a mainframe. But so those are the type of things we're thinking about, which is what are the new skills we need from a capability standpoint that we're going to need to be able to deal with that new world.
Yeah. Though, we all started using computers as well. So everyone had to. It wasn't just that you had a computer person who used the computer, right?
Correct.
So you got to train the whole organization. But staying with the theme of second order risks. So when things that used to take 60 days take 2 minutes, what happens when regulators are overwhelmed with, approving preclinical work, for example, on, a couple of orders of magnitude, maybe 3 orders of magnitude more drugs than they had to do in the past? Can something break down there? How are we thinking about, as an industry, as a company leading on what needs to happen? Likewise, it's okay for us to pay for 10 drugs where the median price is $200,000 a year. What happens when you've got 1,000 drugs like that, and so on? So how do we think about these second order risks of? So they're not really risks in some ways. It's a penalty for success, right?
Correct. Exactly.
But how do we think about that?
Yeah. So I think from a regulator standpoint, I think they are trying to deal with it, I would say, in a reactive manner by both hiring more people and also using systems to be able to help them with some of the repetitive work that actually where technology might prevent mistakes. Just use humans when you have a very big set of things to do under tight timelines with a very high load. The other piece too is platforms. As we move to the world of acceleration of biology, and I think Moderna is a good example, but you have the same thing with gene editing, CRISPR, and others, is the platform nature of what we do helps actually the regulator. In a sense, if you go back to my example, the RSV vaccine or a flu vaccine use 100% the same chemistry, the same chemicals in your body than the COVID vaccine. Yeah. So instead of a traditional pharma where every drug is a different chemical entity with a lot of unknown in terms of the risk, in terms of safety and so on, here at least because of the huge database we gathered and the regulator have with COVID, there's actually much more insight in terms of the downside risk than in an analog world where every molecule is different. So I think that's another piece that is helpful on the side of cost that you talk about. I don't think any of us think that all of us as humans are going to need 1,000 drugs at high cost. I think actually by the customization of the medicines, like we're doing in cancer, where we literally make individualized medicine. I actually think we're going to disrupt other fields like chemotherapy and other drugs, where everybody gets the same drug. They work for some people, but for some people, they don't work. They have a lot of side effects, having impact on productivity, of course, quality of life, and so on. So I think actually the more you're going to have powerful, individualized medicine, the better the quality of life is going to be, the better the return on the cost of a drug, and the less you're going to have in terms of healthcare infrastructure and costs. I mean, look what's happening now with the GLP-1s, just in terms of an example, which is, yes, the GLP-1s are expensive, but think about the burden of disease when somebody becomes diabetes, has heart failure, gets hospitalized, the productivity impact, and so on. It's actually a gigantic cost. Obesity, as we've known for a long time, is a gigantic burden to society. So I think actually science, by preventing problem or dealing with problem early, will actually drive a lot of efficiency and, of course, much higher quality of life and life expectancy.
Yeah, for sure. So when you talk about personalized medicine and this vision, obviously it's something I share. I'm really excited by it. There's going to be a transition point where access is going to be an issue. So how do we think about, are there concerns around ethical or responsible concerns around who gets access to these, what's the underlying data sets that enables the creation of drugs that treat certain groups of people? And how do we think about equity in that sense? Or do we not need to think about it? We're pushing the science and equity will follow.
No, we need to think about it, obviously. I think it goes back to scale. Like we've seen with most technology, when you think about price for access, then we're going to talk about geography and other component, but price is an important point for access. As we've seen in many industries, scale has a big impact on price. And then again, going back to technology that we have access today allows us, if you look at our individualized cancer vaccine today, there's still a very high labor cost part of a component of every drug because it's individualized. But as you start to plug in, as we're doing today, robotics, as you start to plug in digital systems, as you start to plug in AI, and you start to actually be able to run your asset at your factory 24/7, you actually take the cost down. And so actually, I think this is another example where technology is going to enable us to get to price point that were not really possible in a world where you don't have volume and or you don't have technology driving that volume. So I think that we're going to see, like you saw with sequencing, the cost of sequencing used to be $1 billion per genome. It's actually now in a couple $100. Professionals believe it's going to be soon less than $100. And then when you think about value, because you basically, your gene don't change, so you sequence once. So if you're able to get to a very large volume of a local, I will argue that $100 investment by the healthcare system to get everybody's genome is an incredible return on that $100, because a lot of us will start to see disease that we have a high risk for, that if you change things or take some medicines, you're actually going to save downstream a lot of money. The key is not to get sick. I think we need to move from sick care, which is healthcare today is not healthcare for me, it's sick care. We need to move to true healthcare where we understand your basically genetic backbone. We need to understand your current state in terms of epigenetics, in terms of all your blood work and so on. And I'm talking hundreds of biomarkers, not just, your cholesterol and one or two more, hundreds. And then being able to use that to really get a very clear scientific picture of where is your body now, what are the strengths of your body, what are the issues of your body and your genes and so on, and come with customized recommendation, which again, another use of AI begins to be controlled from a capability standpoint, hallucination standpoint, ethical standpoint, but where you could see actually the democratization of medicine that today you see in very high-end, $100,000 annual, private clinics.
Yeah.
But that type of knowledge, because it's all knowledge, can then be decimated at scale, where I think actually is going to increase access. So I think that actually this scientific and technology revolution we're living now is going to enable us to stop things that are just awful. I mean, think about it today in Boston, as you might be aware, between the richest zip code and the poorest zip code, there's 15 years life expectancy difference. 15 years.
Yeah,
it's incredible. It's awful.
2 miles in 15 years. Yes,
correct.
It is. So, I find this really exciting. The whole idea of health and illness as an information problem that can be solved, right?
Correct.
And we could spend all our time talking about this, but I just want to make sure that, given that the focus of this webinar is not so much on the application and the upside of the technology, but care around responsible AI, I'd like to probe on one of these. When you have all that data from so many people, it raises issues of privacy, bias, cybersecurity, etc. How should we be thinking about those? Because there's a trade-off between, how much data we have and how much those risks are either real or perceived.
100%. And the way I'm trying to coach the team internally is to think about it like we are a bank. And actually, we're also talking to banks to help us, because as we know, bank, information is money, or money is information, if you're a bank. And so the bar is very, very high in terms of them being sure that, your money and my money is not mixed up in terms of reporting, and that the risk of cyber attack on the bank. And so I think technology like blockchain, the ability to use actually AI, which we are starting to do pretty intensively in protecting ourselves against cyber attacks, or being able to see patterns in the entire network very quickly, very early, is a very important tool that we need to develop and really become best in class at, which is why I use the bank as a bar, or like what is the DoD doing. Those are the type of things we talk about internally, is because of the data we are going to have and the importance of preserving that data. It's already the case in the individual cancer vaccine. We do not have your name for privacy reasons. We don't need your name. to make a product for you. But what we have is your genome.
Yes.
And so we use blockchain today to protect the integrity of your genome so that they don't become, a risk for us in terms of if we were to have a cyber attack, like, some people have had in different industries, that your genome is out there. Again, we will not have your name, so your name will not be associated to it, but your genome could be out there if we had a breach of data. So that's why we're trying to think about how do we use technology to actually help us, because that information is very precious and we have responsibility to it.
That's amazing. Satish, you have any questions from you? I've got a
Yeah,
couple more, but I wanna give you a
Staphane,
chance.
it's also super fascinating, right? How your thoughts are around risk and managing those. I really want to build up on some of the things you said, what you see as a longer term vision, not just for Moderna in the near term, but also for the industry, right? Where do you see your personal long term vision, and where do you see the industry going, or the evolution of using AI over the next decade, just at a broad level? That'll be fascinating to know.
So, as we just were mentioning, if you think about it, this is an industry of information. But we have always described it to our teams, which is why we've been digital since the beginning as we built the company. And that's why also adding AI was actually pretty easy for us, given we had a lot of big data across the entire value chain. Is we basically make decisions on scientific experiments. What do you do next? We make decisions on drugs based on data in animal, data in humans, pick the dose. And if you think about healthcare, as we just spoke about, our current state of health, my current state of health, can be defined by numbers across a lot of parameters. And if you think about where biology is going, we are, I think, a few years away. I don't think it's 10 years. I think it's a few years away to have an understanding of most of a human's biology. It's going exponential right now. It has been for a while. There's not a week that goes by where you don't have a few papers that are reshaping how we think about human biology, because it's enabled by sequencing and sequencing cost dropping, big data, robotics, and you have this exponential explosion of knowledge. But if you think about it, what's happening in one human body is a finite problem. It is not infinite. And it's a closed system. So of course it has interaction with outside, I breathe a virus, I'm going to get a virus infection, what I eat with bacteria and microbiome and so on. But if you think about it, the number of genes are finite. The number of molecules that my body has are finite. And the interaction, the ones known, can be modeled. And so if you think about it, we're going to get into a world where, a bit like you see in Star Trek and other science fiction series, where you're going to be able to get a pulse of me at any moment of time through technology. You're going to have the blueprint of who I am as my genes, and then you're going to layer on more things. And I think we're going to start to see, which we know disease don't happen overnight. Accident, like a car accident, happen just in the moment, but disease do not happen overnight. Disease sometimes progress for years. And so if you get to start to see the trend of divergence from healthy to very micro start of a disease, and you can correct it, then the disease never happens. And so it's quite fascinating how I believe the next 5-10 years are going to be extraordinary, very science fiction-y for all of us in terms of how we live. I mean, just look at one example that is being scaled as we speak, which is liquid biopsy, the ability to see cancer in a blood draw. And by the way, once you pick the cancer DNA, you're able to tell from which organ it's coming from. In the signature of the chemical, the piece of DNA. That's remarkable. So think about a world that I think is very close to us, where we should all do that type of test every year when you do your annual physical. Because if you didn't have it last year, but you have cancer this year, it's only 1 year old. Most people don't realize, but in cancer speed, 1 year old is not old.
Yes.
So the ability to correct it at that time through surgery and or individualized technology, like I described, that Moderna is working on. What if you had a world where we do a blood draw every year, and most people never develop cancer as a disease. That's transforming. You know, we just spoke about the GLP and obesity. It is well known that it's very important for our health to sleep, to eat healthy, and to do exercise. What if you had all the technology to help you to do those things, either by yourself or encouraged by systems that will give you data and facts to basically create feedback loops and to gamify your health? And there's some very interesting things that are going to happen that are already starting to happen.
That's fascinating and really exciting. Just as an aside, I think we're done here, but the idea that we have to gamify health to make people care for themselves is incredible to me, just because we're already in a game called life, and the
Yes.
prize is live longer.
Yes.
But yet we have to give people little nudges and prizes to make them think about
Yeah.
it, which is
And you see it. I
fascinating.
mean, I don't know if you guys have ever played with it, but you know, I have an Apple Watch, and I used to do sport before, but now I'm competing against myself on everything. You know, how do I run faster? So I do muscle training with my coach for my legs, and then how do I breathe? We realized my oxygen was the issue, but I got into learning new breathing techniques, and I increased again my performance. So it's really fascinating how we're using data and science with the right coach. And again, given AI systems, we're all going to have a coach in our watch, being able to coach us on a lot of things. And so the democratization of health and knowledge, I think, is going to be a really exciting outcome of what happens in the next 10 years. And a big, you know, equalizer. I always worry deeply about health inequalities. I think wealth inequalities are very terrible, but I think health inequalities are just awful. And they're awful today. And I think technology is going to help us solve a lot of health inequalities.
I think it will. I also think that we will go through tremendous transformation that might be painful.
Yes.
The role of a physician, the role of an individual, workforce, and so on. And in many ways, I think we are lucky. We're in a position where we can think about these things and be excited about them, but it'll be painful. But I want to be respectful of your time.
Yes, I need to run.
Yes.
Thank you so much.